2021. Y hoy vamos a hablar sobre un tema que no es un tema del que se habla frecuentemente en España. Vamos a hablar sobre la vecindad oriental, sobre un territorio, sobre los países que están ubicados entre Europa y Rusia. Es un tema del que depende directamente la seguridad europea. Sin más, ahora pasaré a inglés porque nuestros panelistas y nuestros invitados de hoy van a hablar en inglés. Bienvenidos a todos y espero que este tema sea de vuestro interés. Good morning for everybody. I'm really very happy to say hello for three very, very important, very interesting and very illustrated panelists today. They are here to talk about the eastern neighborhood between the European Union and Russia. They are here to talk about the countries geographically located between Russia and the European Union. The countries I mean about Ukraine, Belarus, Moldavia, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, about the countries which are part of the eastern neighborhood of the European Union, but also what is maybe the most important thing to mention about is that they are countries which have to coexist with an uncomfortable neighbor that seeks to limit their sovereignty in choosing their foreign policy. So the breakdown of cooperation between Russia and the European Union in the wake of the annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine in 2014 has worsened not only relations between these two actors, between the Russia and the European Union, but also their competition in the post-Soviet space. And these countries, these in-between countries, are theater of this competition and also of this uncomfortable coexisting with Russia. So let's start with Edward Lucas. He's non-resident senior fellow at the CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis. Also, he's a many things, but I will mention only one more. He was a senior editor at the magazine The Economist. So, Edward, welcome to Madrid virtually. I hope that we'll see next time face to face. And the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much indeed, Mira, and congratulations on holding this event, because it's one of the things that's really bothered me over the many years is that the security debate about Eastern Europe tends to happen in Northern Europe. And there is a conference almost every month in Oslo or Stockholm or Denmark or Tallinn or Riga or Vilnius or Berlin or London about these issues. And it hasn't been on the security agenda so much in Southern Europe, not least because you have other things to worry about. And we're guilty of this. We don't talk about the Sahel and jihadism and the problems in sub-Saharan and Saharan Africa the way you do. But it's really great to be here virtually. And I really hope that we'll be able to do this with atoms rather than electrons in the not too distant future. And I also want to say it's just great being on the panel with Anna and James, and perhaps my first message is listen to what Anna says, because I think the overwhelming message of the last 30 years is that the arrogant West didn't listen to the knowledgeable East. I remember back in the early 1990s, Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians and Ukrainians and Georgians and Poles and Czechs and Slovaks and others saying, watch out, Russia's going in the wrong direction. Now, this was in the Yeltsin era, and people from these countries came to London and to Brussels and to Berlin, and they said, watch out, there is this overlap between the old KGB and organized crime, that there is this nationalist, neo-imperialist, whatever you want to call it, strand that's still there in Russian foreign policy thinking. It's exemplified perhaps by Yevgeny Primakov, the head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, but don't think this is over. And these people from these countries came and warned us, and we didn't listen. And any discussion of European security, now as we are aware of what some people say is the new threat from Russia, or gosh, since 2014, we've been really worried about Russia and Ukraine, has to start off from this position that we missed the train. We missed it again and again and again and again. And so we have to approach this as Western Europeans from a position of humility. I obviously exempt James Sherr from this criticism, because he was one of the very few people who was warning about this also back in the 1990s. What we see, I think, in this neighborhood is a mixture of competition and co-option. We see Russia successfully co-opting some of the ex-Soviet countries. I wouldn't say they are annexing them, but they're co-opting them. The strongest example of this is Belarus. We also see it to some extent in Armenia, to some extent in Georgia, perhaps to a larger extent in Azerbaijan. That these countries, along, one could argue, with bits of countries of Central Asia, are being co-opted into a new Russian-led security sphere. It's not just military, although it has military elements. It's not just intelligence and security, though it has those elements. It's not just economic, though it has those elements. But it's a kind of what one might call sharp power empire, with Russia at the center. And we see this very clearly, and I'll just dwell on this for a bit in the case of Belarus, where Belarus is part of a union state with Russia. That's been on the agenda since 1996. It's never been consummated. It's like people who are going out for years but never actually get really married, although they always will say they're engaged. They've never had a common currency. There isn't a proper single market. There's not a single legal space. But Russia is gradually pulling Belarus towards it. Perhaps the most salient example of that is the new air defense base in Belarus, the first new permanent Russian base since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In theory, it's just air defense training, but we all know that what Russia trains one day, it exercises the next. And although President Lukashenko drags his feet on this, I hesitate to call him President Lukashenko because, of course, he didn't really win the presidential election, but although he drags his feet and he still hasn't recognized Russia's annexation of Crimea or the so-called independence of the so-called republics of Luhansk and Donbass in Ukraine or in the Russian protectorates in Georgia, the trajectory is in one direction. And so that's the co-option. But there's also the competition. And here, Ukraine is really important. And Anna will talk more about this. But Ukraine is fundamentally a success story in a way that we couldn't have imagined in the 1990s. This is a country which has a vibrant pluralistic democracy, a vibrant pluralistic media, a stable and growing economy. There's huge problems still in Ukraine, and we could spend an entire panel talking about problems of corruption, problems of administrative reform, problems of reform of the energy sector. But the fact is, Ukraine's statehood is not in doubt. And that is a very, very different outlook from in 2014, when it seemed, after the devastating effect of the Yanukovych years, as though Ukraine might really fall victim to Russian imperialism, and you could have a Novorossiya stretching all the way to Odessa, and Ukraine being cut off from the Black Sea. Ukraine has consolidated its cultural identity, it's consolidated its statehood, it's consolidated its society, and the long-term prospects for Ukraine are now really bright. And this is a terrifying threat if you're Vladimir Putin, because what it shows is that a big Slavic Orthodox country can be a democracy, that this Russian specifica, this idea that Russia cannot be understood with the mind, that it has to be different, it has to be run in an authoritarian way, whether by the Cheka or by the Okhrana or by the NKVD or now by the FSB, that Russia is so big it's special. That contention is disproved by Ukraine's existence, and that's really scary for for Russia. And as Ukraine develops and as Russia stagnates, that gap's going to become even sharper. And so that's why we see this extraordinary behavior by Vladimir Putin, writing a history essay of, I think, 20,000 words, which, if I think had been submitted to any university in the West, and certainly if anyone had sent it to you, Mira, I think you would have given it a D, maybe 10 points for effort and another 10 points for length, but 1 point for facts and no point for argument. But this really, it gets on Putin's nerves, the whole idea of Ukrainian statehood and Ukrainian successful statehood. And so this is the battleground. And the question for us in the West is, how do we help? And we could do so much more. We have, as I said at the beginning, we've missed the train again and again. We've seen it in terms of threats to our security, but not understood that our security is bound up with the security of the countries closer to Russia. We need to do more for the Baltic states in Northern Europe and Northeastern Europe to put together a stronger package of military and economic security there. We need to do more in the Black Sea, where we really don't have a Black Sea strategy, which is an enormous gap in our security. And we need to do more to support the Belarusian opposition, and we need to do more to support Ukraine and to support Georgia, to prevent them falling, to prevent this Russian strategy of co-option succeeding. There is an enormous agenda. There's many things we could do. I would just highlight one thing, which is to help Russians who are fleeing Russia. This is something the EU could do so easily. The hundreds, perhaps thousands now, of Russian journalists, academics, think tankers, campaigners, people from NGOs who are leaving Russia, and this is not Mikhail Khodorkovsky. They're not turning up in the West with their billions. They're turning up in the West with a suitcase. And they need our support. This is something the European Union could do to show that we care about these people. And there's much, much more. But I hope to get onto that in the discussion. I will stop now. And please listen very attentively to what Anna says, because we have so much to learn from our Ukrainian counterparts. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. I'm sure that we will we will pay attention what Anna will said, but also please pay attention what will said James Sherr, because I'm pretty sure that he has to say a lot of things. He's currently Senior Fellow of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at the International Center for Defense and Security. She's an Associate Fellow and former head of the Russia and Eurasia Program at the Chatham House. And I had the opportunity to meet James like 2 years ago here in Madrid in Spain. And he impressed me, I have to confess. So impressed me what he said and how impressed me his mental dynamic, we can say, when he talked about Russia. So James, the floor is yours, and please, I know that you will talk about the security issues from the Russian point of view. So it's promised that will be very exciting. Welcome to Madrid, and thank you very much to be here with us.
Mira, thank you so much. This meeting is good. Being physically in Madrid, of course, is better. Let me endeavor to make 3 main points in 9 minutes. First, Russia's view, by which I mean the political, defense, and security establishment, the view of those who matter, is unchanged. At a fundamental level, in many respects, it's been unchanged for 300 years, but in very concrete, detailed, and specific terms, it has been unchanged for at least 10 years, that is even before the events of 2014. The Kremlin views the relationship with what is now called the collective West as intrinsically adversarial. It is not looking for better understanding. It is not looking even for improved relations. What it seeks are concrete changes in the security architecture of Europe, and nothing less. At the same time, the Kremlin continues to recalibrate priorities and resources and the relationship between means and ends. Nevertheless, Belarus and Ukraine remain for Russia cardinal interests. Many in the Russian establishment expert community are now talking about the revival of Stalin's doctrine of the осажденная крепость, the besieged fortress. There is a lot in that, but please understand, in this conception, Belarus and Ukraine are inside the besieged fortress and will be treated as immediate vital interests. But the conditions between the two are very different. And that leads me to a controversial point. Russia's cardinal interests systemically are under greater threat in Ukraine than they are in Belarus, even though the immediate challenges in Belarus appear to be greater. In 2004, before the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the values of the Ukrainian opposition and many members of the Ukrainian opposition were present in Ukraine's parliament and even in a number of state institutions. This is not the case in Belarus. And that in large part explains why Ukraine is a much more difficult proposition for Russia to deal with than Belarus is. Why does Putin wish to keep Lukashenko in place, despite the fact that they have a bad relationship? It's very simple, because Lukashenko understands power. He is not afraid of it, he is not afraid of using it, and he is tenacious. And therefore, the relevant comparison here is not Lukashenko and Ukraine's Yanukovych, it's Lukashenko and Bashar al-Assad. And that, I would suggest, is the way the Russians view it. Tikhanovskaya, Tsipkalo, and a number of other members of the establishment opposition might well be genuinely pro-Russian, and I believe they are, but so was Alexander Dubček. This is not the point. The question is, with whom are Russian interests safe? My second point, Russia's objective in Ukraine, and one has to reiterate this on every occasion in Western Europe because it's just not understood. Russia's objective in Ukraine is to subordinate it, all of it, not part of it. Russia believes it is entitled to be the arbiter of what Ukraine's independence means and what it does not mean. So please understand, we are not looking at a conflict in Donbass. We are looking at a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And therefore, we should also understand the question, what are Russia's red lines that is posed at almost every panel, is the wrong question. Russia can dramatically move the goalposts tomorrow if it concludes the time is right. That is to say, that if it concludes that the West and Ukraine are fragmented enough, distracted enough, and enfeebled enough that Russia will accomplish its objectives and not endanger itself by doing so. And it will do these things before any of these so-called red lines are crossed, before anyone gives candidate membership to Ukraine to join the EU or invites Ukraine to submit a membership action plan in NATO. The whole question of red lines is basically dreamt up in the Kremlin in order to inhibit and intimidate everybody else. And stymie thinking about what our interests are and the issues that actually matter. My last point, which is topical, and it concerns the Zapad exercises. There are at least two differences from those being conducted now and the exercises that were last conducted in 2017. in 2017, the Russians publicly understated the size and magnitude of forces that were taking part. Today, they appear to be greatly overestimating them. The public totals today that are presented are about 8 times the totals presented in 2017, and the actual figure is probably very similar. What this demonstrates, and what in some way it is designed to demonstrate, is Russia's permissive application of a major change that took place last year, when it was decided that Russia's constitution takes precedence over international law and international treaties. And by Russia's constitution, you can interpret that as meaning the whim of the president. So this is a flagrant violation of the Vienna document about reporting and about exercises and under what conditions they can be conducted. And there it is in very flagrant form. And what is the second difference? Yes, obviously, using the exercises as a means of applying direct pressure in immediate terms on Latvia and Lithuania, but in fundamental terms on the collective West as a whole, which leads to a third point about all these exercises. There are many objectives behind this exercise, but one of them, which is always there, is what the Russians call razvedka boyem, which is reconnaissance or intelligence by means of combat. By engineering, by weaponizing migration across the borders of Latvia and Lithuania, primarily Lithuania, the Russians are giving themselves a bird's eye seat in the West's ability to react to this situation and coordinate its affairs or not. For years, there has been discussion and lots of erudite papers written about EU-NATO cooperation. But I am quite confident that until this happened, no practical thought has been given over here to what steps NATO could and should take to reinforce Frontex units of the EU on the border. All of this is being probed and examined and assessed. So, without a conclusion, since my time is up, let me just stop there, and I look forward to hearing what Anna has to say.
Thank you very much, James. And now, please pay attention to what Anna will say. Anna Korbut, she was Academy Associated Russia and Eurasia Program at Chatham House. Currently, she's journalist and political analyst on issues on Ukraine. And Anna, please, welcome to Madrid, and floor is yours. Thank you very much to be with us today.
Thank you, Mira, for having me, and thank you to Edward and James for their previous contributions, to Edward for consistently putting the voices of Eastern and Central Europeans in the spotlight, and to James as well, because his analysis has always been spot on. A lot has been said of what I had in mind as well for this conversation, but from the perspective of, well, Ukraine, because I am from Ukraine, and probably our Ukraine's neighbors in the same predicament or in similar predicament, I would like to make 3 points. The first point would be that in a lot of similar discussions, similar to the ones that we have today, there is a lot of focus when it comes to Eastern Partnership or Eastern Neighborhood, is on the position of these countries between Russia and the EU, or of them as a territory, as a field that is lumped together between Russia and the EU or Russia and the West. This would be a little bit like talking about the countries of Latin America as a territory between, say, the interests of Spain or the US. However, I would suggest that it would be more helpful to look at the countries of Eastern Partnership or Eastern and Central European countries as entities from the perspective of what actually works for their development better. Their development, societal, social, political, democratic, economic, environmental, you name it. And in these aspects, if we look at, for example, Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia on one side, and then Belarus or Russia proper on the other side, we see a very stark difference. And that difference is that over the years, both Ukraine and, say, Moldova have had a lot of issues with government, political issues, societal issues, corruption issues, and they continue to have those. And that's why we, from time to time, see very difficult elections or very competitive elections, as well as revolutions. But at the end of the day, when with the current situation in Belarus or with the current situation in Russia, for instance, we see that people from Belarus are fleeing to Ukraine, maybe as their first point and then of departure to other countries of the EU for shelter. We have recently seen the offices, some employees of international media or US-funded media in Russia move into Kyiv for security, and just because it's no longer possible for them to keep working in Russia because of the different changes in law and different that de facto mean persecution of these people eventually for their journalistic work. So in that regard, despite of all of the problems, all of the flaws that countries like Ukraine or Moldova or Georgia have, they still have a chance to develop, a prospect of development, and they are developing. They're improving the situation there. So that is important. What they to look at what they aspire for and at what they look to achieve, even at a very high political, economic, and societal cost. In the case of Ukraine, this is because of war. In the case of other countries as well, because of conflicts or political turbulences. When it comes to Ukraine, for example, Ukraine's foreign policy strategy, some of the key objectives that should contribute to Ukraine's security and prosperity include, of course, restoration of peace and territorial integrity, and effective resistance against the aggressor state, which is Russia. This leads me to kind of the next point. When a country is ready to defend its sovereignty and its right to choose, its security capacity, its capacity to do so should be supported. And partly we've seen that to some extent from the West, that kind of support with propping Ukraine's security over the years of war that has lasted now for 7 into its 8th year. Some of it has not been enough, some of it has been helpful, but that should continue in order to equip the countries that do want to develop and do want to pursue a pro-democratic and eventually democratize fully and develop fully. They should receive the support to strengthen their capability to defend itself, because in the short-term future, it is highly unlikely that anyone will defend them but themselves. So their ability, their capacity to do so should be strengthened. In one example, we have, in that there has been some success with Volodymyr Zelensky's latest visit to Washington and meeting with Joe Biden, where they had a number of documents signed between Ukraine and the US on the support of Ukraine's security, defense and military reforms in Ukraine. There was a security package of $60 million, including armaments, lethal and non-lethal equipment for protection, cybersecurity, and so forth. So this can be bilateral. It can also be multilateral. Clearly, the prospect of Ukraine's membership in NATO and the EU, which are declared Ukraine's strategic objectives are probably not feasible in the short term, but bilateral and multilateral support is feasible and is possible. And then the third item is that it would be useful to keep close attention on Russia's action in the neighboring countries. And this is not just for policymakers or decision makers, but for civil societies, NGOs, media, and in other European countries. And whereas, for instance, we see a lot of attention to the situation in, say, the occupied Crimea or the Kremlin-controlled parts of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast in eastern Ukraine, in countries of Eastern Europe, countries of Central Europe, countries of Northern Europe, we don't see that much attention to what's going on in these places, for example, even in Spain. So, and then after, I don't know, 5 years, we see facts on the ground completely changed as a fait accompli, and they are seen as a fait accompli. But those 2 or 5 years, there have been changes gradually happening that should have been noticed. And what I mean is, for example, in the occupied Crimea, people who either do not take up Russian passports or are seen as unreliable by the occupational authorities, they have been pushed out or deported out of Crimea. And then the citizens of Russia from mainland Russia have been brought to Crimea, to the occupied Crimea, change in the demographic structure and change in facts on the ground, so that later they can say, well, see, we have more support here than we used to, or this has been support for us for all these years. For example, there was a report in the late 2017 that specified that almost 2,500 Ukrainian citizens, foreign citizens, and people without citizenship were forcibly deported from the territory of Crimea to mainland Ukraine or to other countries. And so the Russian migration legislation was used proactively as a tool to change this demographic structure. And what we see now is, for instance, the persecution of Crimean Tatars, which I try to draw attention to every time I speak in international platforms, because I see that this issue is not highlighted enough. Just at the beginning of September, we saw 5 Crimean Tatars arrested, including deputy chairman of the Mejlis, the representative body of Crimean Tatars. His name is Nariman Jalalov, and he finalizes the circle of the leaders of Mejlis who are either arrested or facing criminal charges. The 2 other leaders live in Ukraine, in the mainland Ukraine. They have no opportunity to go back to Crimea or to continue their activity in Crimea because they face criminal charges there, and clearly they would not be able to do anything or enter Crimea at this point. And so, and some of these people, a lot of Crimean Tatars are facing anywhere from 10 years in jail based on quite bogus allegations from either the courts that represent the occupational authorities of Crimea or from Russian courts. Another point is that, for example, the participation of Ukrainian citizens who reside in the occupied parts of Luhansk and Donetsk territory in the Russian parliamentary election, which is again against the practices that against the practice of looking for any reconciliation with Kiev on part of Moscow. And there have been reports in the media as well as from the occupied territory that some of these people work in the public industry, so teachers, doctors, etc. And they're forced or pushed or encouraged to register and vote in the Russian elections. So these processes, I think it makes more sense. Like I see a lot of news, I see a lot of coverage of processes like that in, say, Ukrainian press, Ukrainian media, Ukrainian NGOs, but not much more in the West. And I think that's one of the aspects that deserves closer attention from not just policymakers or decision makers, but also from media, NGOs who work on these topics and just cover things generally. I think I'll stop here and happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I definitely really agree with you that we have to pay more attention what is going on in neighborhood in all these countries between the European Union and Russia. I like very much your idea that we have to think about these countries like independent entities, not only the countries between. And one of the reasons why I organized this roundtable is the first aim of it is just to introduce this discussion in Spain, because I used to say Russia is sufficiently far from Spain and they just don't, it's not fair to say that Spain does not care. Spain care, and Spain is very solidary with the Baltic states, from the military point of view. But I definitely think that we have to introduce these topics in our discussion. And maybe we have to start from the public opinion, because politicians started to think about topics which are interesting for their citizens. Not always is the case that political elites introduce these topics. But definitely also, I think that, as always, was the one of the main security issues of the Europe and the West is the question of Russia. And I think that the European Parliament is completely aware of it. And another thing is how the European Union can deal with it. This is another question. So I like many things what you have said, but just now we will change a little bit the order. And my first question is for James about Anna mentioned the meeting between President Zelensky and President Biden, and she highlighted that at the end of the day, Ukraine have to be able to defend itself. This is true, and this is definitely what we have to accept, and what we have to try to support Ukraine for do that. And also we know, at least after during the Cold War and the first years in post-Cold War period, that the eastern border of Europe is the first line of defense of the United States. So my question now, and regarding what happened in Afghanistan and what is happening lately in transatlantic relationship, my question for James is, what do you think, can the European Union count with this support of the United States? Because many people said if the United States just abandon Afghanistan, in the same way can abandon Ukraine, Taiwan, or another places in the world. I don't share this opinion. I think that United States still is trustful, I lied, but the things are changed. So please, your thoughts about it, James.
Try to confine them to 3, if I may. First, lamentable and disturbing as the US withdrawal from Afghanistan might be, and even more lamentable and disturbing the manner of its execution, one should not forget that Joe Biden has been extremely consistent that this has been his intention all along, long before he became president, long before when he was part of the last administration. So there's no excuse to be surprised, even if we have good reason to be appalled. And we have very good reason to remind Washington, as some have done, this was not a US operation in Afghanistan. It was a NATO operation in Afghanistan, which in fact had enormous significance because that operation was the consequence of the first invocation of Article 5 in defense of the United States. But let's get the proportions right. Secondly, I'm afraid to say, with dismaying confidence, that a sizable majority of the American population do not believe, no longer believe, that the first line of defense of the United States is the border in Europe. I am afraid that is not the case. So the practical political question is the elite, or at least that part of the elite that understands these issues in this way, able to educate the public and explain all of this, rather than evade the question. Now, on the practical issue of Ukraine itself, I fully agree with Anna about the need for Ukraine to be able to defend itself, but we need to understand what we mean by that. If we mean the ability to actually defeat Russian combined arms battle groups in prolonged combat, no, Ukraine is not going to be able to do that, but that is not necessary. What is necessary and possible, and to some extent being achieved already, is the creation of a capability in the armed forces, supported by the country as a whole, to impose horrendous damage on a Russian attacker that will raise risks that Russia does not want to entertain. And as I said, a fair amount of this has already been done. What greatly weakens and diminishes Ukraine's entire image in the West is the insistence, compulsive insistence of President Zelensky and a number of others, that Ukraine needs a NATO membership perspective, and without it, its security is not sustainable. It is not true, but it also actually reinforces the main propaganda point of Russia, that Ukraine is merely a ward of the West, that it has no capacity to look after itself or sustain itself on its own. And here we have the president of Ukraine virtually echoing this. Just one final point, if I may, because you mentioned EU. We talk in the defense context today about the Suwalki gap between Belarus and Lithuania and Poland and its critical importance. The real strategic gap that we need to be mindful of is the gap in policies and strategic orientations between the EU and NATO. That is the big gap that the Russians are aware of, as well as the fundamental gap in outlook between the United States and a number of its European allies, most of all Germany, not because the gap is greatest with regard to Germany, but because Germany's position is so much more important than the position of a good many other countries on their own.
Thank you, James. And my second question now is for Anna. And Anna, please, if you would like to make any comments, what just James said, but my question is about what Edward first said about that we can do much more to help Ukraine, to help Belarus, and even to help Russians. So you you are here, and I think that we have opportunity to hear from you what, from the point of view of, in this case, Ukrainians, is the most urgent help which the European Union and the West can give to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on James's point, I guess the talk about reinforcing Ukraine's capacity to defend itself, as he rightly described, not to defeat Russia, but to defend itself. And the course, the official course, and the insistence of the current leadership on NATO membership, they are intertwined processes, but they are also parallel processes. And the position, the current leadership about insisting on getting NATO membership, I guess it can irritate a lot of partners and a lot of people in the West and in NATO countries. But at the end of the day, it's also the expression of the strategic position that Ukraine is seeking. So at least even if they don't honor it, even if it's not possible in the near or midterm future, it should be kept on the agenda, and yeah, it should be talked about. In terms of what can be done to help Ukraine or Belarus, in this case, or Moldova, I wouldn't talk in terms of urgency. I would talk in terms of long-term prospect, long-term outlook, consistency, and determination. One thing is that one thing that I tend to hear in discussions is that, well, if there are, a focus on internal problems, and that is a slow pace of reforms or lack of reforms in some areas, or corruption and things like that, as an excuse to say, well, not to justify the violation of territorial integrity, sovereignty, not to justify the war, but kind of to say that, well, these are two equal wars, which they are not. Because the war is the war. It has its political, societal, human, and economic cost. And it is happening now. And then the development, it can be slower or faster. It can be more or less consistent, but it's not the same as, it doesn't have the same cost as the war does, for sure, for society or for political agenda or for economic agenda. In terms of what can be done to help, well, Ukraine specifically, there are different tracks. So as I said, one, as I mentioned, is help to reform Ukraine's defense capacity. And that should be a very mutual process. There are problems on both sides, both Ukraine's side and that of the West, of the Western actors. So these problems should be dealt with, but that is one segment of help. The other segment is the one that's determined by the association agreement with the EU and the DCFTA agreement. So there are some changes that are necessary to expand and advance Ukraine's integration with different elements of the EU, different markets like digital, customs, etc. So that should be a focus, another focus. And the third point would be, it's illustrated well by the latest developments on the Nord Stream 2 project, which serve Germany's interests, for example, but undermine Ukraine's vital security and energy interests. And so clearly that is not in terms of assistance, but that is in terms of actually acting to undermine Ukraine's security and the interests in this case, Germany's interests, which is clearly, it's realpolitik. That is how it works. But that is something, if you work on assistance and support on the one hand, and then you take these projects and you take these actions, that it kind of undermines the purpose.
So thank you very much. Your last point, I'm without the dare now with this final points about the Nord Stream. But I'm backing to Edward, and my question for Edward is about what James have been talking about, the red lines, and about how Russia has, he talking in his first point about the broader strategy and tradition in strategic thinking of Russia, but also in his second point, he highlighted how Russia just take advantage of opportunity. So red lines is wrong way to talk about Russian actions in countries of the Eastern neighborhood. And also James said about in last intervention about the gap between the United States and the European countries, about all Germany and France, on outlook when we talk about on Eastern neighborhood countries. So my question is for Edward is, you are in senior associate analyst in one American think tank in CEPA, and so I think that you are right person to talk about how we can overcome this gap between the Europe and United States when we would like to address the issues on Eastern neighborhood countries. And also, if you like, and if you have time to comment this gap between broader strategy and opportunistic strategy on Russia. But if you have time, we have 8 minutes. So please.
Well, thank you, Mira. And I've been taking notes on what Anna and James are saying, and these are great points. And I do hope you'll put this discussion up on the internet so we can share it with our friends on social media. I think that I'll say a few brief points. One is there's an excellent piece coming out from Chatham House shortly by Keir Giles on the kind of psychological basis for dealing with the Russian threat. And without preempting it, he makes the point that we in the West tend to think that confrontation is bad and that all problems can be solved by dialogue. And this is not true. Sometimes you have real clashes of interest, and we need to start off by just accepting that Russia and the West have different interests. Russia wants things that we can't tolerate, and that therefore there is going to be confrontation. We can try and manage the confrontation, we can hopefully win it, but we can't just think we can talk it away. And that's something that's very deeply embedded in particularly German approach, that there are no problems that can't be solved by discussion. Well, sorry, actually there are problems that can't be solved by discussion, and we just have to accept that. The second point is that Russia succeeds by often through intimidation, by feigning outrage, saying we are absolutely furious, and the only way things are going to improve is if you apologize and back down. And because we tend to think, well, that there must be some truth in that, and so we start off from a position of trying to think what can we do to make Russia happy, and this is wrong. Sometimes you have to respond to Russia's protestations of outrage by saying, well, I'm sorry you're cross about it, but ultimately you've chosen to be cross about this. You've decided that you're going to mind about Ukrainian independence. Germany, after the Second World War, decided it would not mind about the end of the Third Reich, and it would concentrate on having good relations with the Netherlands, Denmark, France, Poland, other countries that had suffered. It's a matter of choice if you're cross, and Russia's decided to get cross about things, and that's Russia's problem, not ours. So that's very important. So please read Keir Giles' paper when it comes out. I think on Friday it's coming out, or possibly tomorrow. The third point I'd make is that the imbalance in transatlantic security is fundamentally the fault of the Europeans. During the Cold War, the United States did the heavy lifting on European security, and after the Cold War, it said to the Europeans, please will you spend more and do more? And we have repeatedly refused to do that. We don't spend our 2%, and what money we do spend, we spend badly. And this makes the Americans impatient and disappointed. And the result is we see increasing strains on the transatlantic alliance, and they're sometimes expressed very rudely by President Trump in a way that may be counterproductive. We can discuss that. Sometimes they're expressed in other terms. But for Europeans, the price of credibility is capability. If the Europeans do not have capabilities, they will not be credible, and we will see more of what we've just seen with the French being sidelined by the British-American deal with Australia. And that's just a fact. You can't talk your way out of it. And it means the big European countries, that's particularly Germany, Italy, France, and Spain, have to match what countries like Poland are doing. They need to spend more, and they need to do more also on the soft stuff, on financial threats, on energy, something where Germany has been particularly weak. So we need to build a security culture in Europe and make the sacrifices, spend the money, take the decisions we need to. And then that will rebalance the transatlantic relationship in a very healthy way, mean that we no longer have to do everything the United States wants. There may be questions, Iran, for example, where we say to the United States, sorry, we don't quite agree with you, but we will be doing so from a position of strength and credibility. And until that happens, we are basically talking emptily. And the penalty for that is paid not chiefly by us, because we are big and rich, and in the end, Russia's not going to mess with us that much. The penalty is mainly paid by our neighbours in the East. And it's no exaggeration to say that the failure of Europe to take security seriously has been paid in blood by Ukrainians.
As you know, the Europeans always are deeply concerned about everything, what is going on.
Gravely concerned.
And it always is the waking up call from the Balkan Wars to the annexation of Crimea, withdrawal for the United States from Afghanistan, AUKUS, the agreement of submarines. So always we are so deeply concerned, and this is like a wake up call always. We have 2 minutes more, and we talk about that we have to introduce these topics in public opinion. So in these 2 minutes, I ask you to say what, from your point of view, should be the headline about the current relationship between the West and these countries in between. I still call them in this way, even I really like a lot the idea of FANA to treat them like entities, independent entities. So what should be the headline of this topic? Maybe James, and you can I see you that you move your head when Edward talks, and if you like to add something, just a very short sentence, please.
2 points in 30 seconds. The first is that I think we should be, as worrying as the capability gap is between the European allies of NATO, most of them anyway, and the United States, the greater worry for me and for us should be the endless capacity of people in the West, including the most important people, including many who regard themselves as experts, to delude themselves and continue doing so, irrespective of the facts and the realities that are plainly in front of them. And the second point is regarding realism with Russia. We have to assume that the fundamentals of Russia's outlook, the fundamental things that divide us in essence, will not change until a mental revolution there has taken place. And that means in practice, a rejuvenation of governing elites and Edward is absolutely right. Until that process begins, if it ever will, we must learn to live with what we have and manage it in a way that is consistent with our interests and avoiding devastating conflict.
Thank you. Anna, please, very quick thoughts.
Yeah, well, coming from the media, I think that the approach of headlines is very fleeting. So I would rather suggest a Twitter feed, a thread with that will be called Watching Closer in More Context. Yeah.
Great, watching closer. Edward, finally.
I would try and invoke the discourse of post-colonialism. The Western left doesn't really understand the Cold War anymore, but it does understand empire. And if one talks about Russian imperialism and that Russia treats its colonies the way that West European countries treated Africa, then I think you're getting into the discussion in a way that may resonate with people aged 40 and under.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to be with here today. And I really promise that next year we will see in Madrid if you can. And I hope that we will talk about these topics before the next year. But next year I promise to invite you to come to Madrid. Thank you very much to you and for our public. Ciao.
Ciao.